All right, we finally got everything going positive and going smooth. I'm using a different laptop tonight, and I originally was trying to do this in my office at work, but unfortunately, there's some kind of firewall that was blocking me from being able to get in and do the Hangout. So I got booted out. So I decided to bring it home and try it here, and we'll see how it goes. So kind of wanted to talk to you guys about chapter 10 and muscle physiology. If you've began to kind of go through it and trying to decipher some of what the notes are talking about, then obviously by now you're probably, saying, what did I get myself into? Trying to decipher exactly what it is, what it's saying, whether or not you're even following anything. So what I kind of want to do is I kind of want to take some of this chapter and I want to kind of debunk a few myths dealing with the chapter first. And then next week I want to make some more specific videos that deal with different attributes about muscle physiology. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you flat out, one of the main reasons why muscle physiology is so challenging for students is because it's dealing with cell biology. It's going down and it's talking about what's happening around the cell. It's talking about what's happening inside the cell, and that really throws people for a loop. I'll tell you something else that really gets people. You got to have a starting place. So if you're trying to figure out where do I begin so that I can understand this chapter, so that I can pass this test, well, the first thing you want to do is start at the neuromuscular junction. That's hands down. If you want to start anywhere, start at the neuromuscular junction. What is the neuromuscular junction? The neuromuscular junction, or the NMJ, as we like to write it in a little, shorthand. The neuromuscular junction is a location where a nerve cell and a muscle cell communicate. That's a neuromuscular junction. It's where a nerve cell and a muscle cell communicate with one another. Now, the muscle cell doesn't talk back to the nerve cell. The nerve cell is the only one doing the talking. The muscle cell is the guy who is acting. So you've got this nerve cell. What kind of nerve cell is it? It's a neuron. And what type of neuron is it? It's a motor neuron. Motor neurons do the same thing no matter what's going on. A motor neuron is always responsible for sending motor commands. So basically, he's sending a signal to an effector. Now, you'll remember the very first chapter, one of the first things we learned was the receptor, control center, and effector. So right now, we are looking at who is talking to the effector. Your control center for voluntary body movement would happen to be your central nervous system, which your central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord talk to effectors like your skeletal muscle using motor neurons, which are these really long nerve cells that send electric signals uh, to different effectors, different organs. In this case, we're talking about skeletal muscle being the effectors. So that motor neuron is charged with the task of sending that electrical signal to your muscle cell. The only problem is that the electric signal is never going to actually come into physical contact with the muscle cell. There's going to have to be something else that the neuron is going to use to communicate with the muscle cell. So that's all of that right there is really a whole section of the chapter, what I just finished talking about. And we're going to talk about that more in depth as the week goes on. We're going to show a video or two of that stuff next week. We'll get into it. So don't freak out. All right. What I want to kind of do is I want to start with one of the slides from your notes. And I'm going to change the view that you've got so you can see what I'm talking about. And we'll go to this slide. And I think the slide that I want is one particular picture. There it is, slide 21. If you've got your notes, check this out. slide 21. And there's a really key concept here that I want to get with slide 21. Okay, I see that my PowerPoint is acting funny. Okay, now what I want to point out to you real quick is you're going to notice here's a bone. Does anybody recognize what bone this is? If you got a bone test coming up, then this is the proximal end of your humerus, which is a long bone in your upper arm. So this is the humerus here. There's the head of the humerus. There's a lesser tubercle. There's a greater tubercle over there. Here's the intertubercular groove. That's right in between here. And the reason why it's called the intertubercular groove is because it's in between the two tubercles, lesser tubercle, greater tubercle. And this tendon actually belongs to your bicep brachii, the bicep in your arm, the one that you flex to make a muscle on your arm. Is that tendon. And that tendon actually passes through the intertubercular groove and continues on up and actually connects in some interesting places on your scapula. But what I want to talk to you guys about is I want to teach you a law. Now, of course, if you go Google this law, you are not going to find it. And that's because it's a law that I made up. It's called the law of Ludacris. Now, if you don't know who Ludacris is a hip hop artist out of Atlanta, Georgia. And many years ago, Ludacris had a song that came out, and during the chorus of the song, you're going to see that during the chorus of the song, it said, "When I move, you move," just like that. All right. So this little thing that I'm about to explain to you is called the law of Ludacris, and you're going to see why I call it that in just a moment. If you get all the way down to the tendon and you break this thing down to its smallest component, here is what we call a muscle fiber. Now, a muscle fiber is another name for a muscle cell. So muscle fiber and muscle cell are the exact same thing. Exact same thing. It's just a different name for it. So if I say muscle fiber, I am talking about a muscle cell. Many times people look at a muscle fiber, they don't view it as a muscle cell because it doesn't look like a normal cell, and it's not supposed to, because remember, structure defines function. You remember that little line I used at the very beginning of the semester, the fact that structure defines function. Well, here we see the structure defines the function. This muscle fiber should resemble a rope to you. If you take a good look at it, it looks like a rope. And typically, you use rope to tie things up, or you use rope to pull something. So in this case, we're not tying anything up. We're using this particular rope to pull something. So this muscle fiber is going to pull something. And when we put a group of muscle fibers together, we make what's called a fascicle. And when we take a group of fascicles and we tie them together in a big bundle, we make what's called a skeletal muscle. So let me back up for a minute. Here is a muscle fiber, also known as a muscle cell. It is a rope. When we take a bundle of these ropes and put them together, a bundle of these muscle cells, a bundle of these muscle fibers, when we take these little cellular ropes and tie them together, we create a fascicle. When we take multiple fascicles, multiple bundles, and tie them together, we make a skeletal muscle. Notice that we have this sheet or this membrane, this connective tissue that wraps around each group of ropes to keep them tied together. Each individual rope has an endomysium that's wrapped around the rope, whereas this fascicle has an individual perimysium wrapped around a bundle of ropes. And then if we take those bundles, we wrap them up with an epimysium. Endo means inner. So this is the wrapping that wraps around the inner ropes. Peri means around. So we've got this wrapping that wraps around the bundle. And then epi means above. So we have the most above or most superficial layer wrapped around the entire thing. And notice that the muscle notice that the skeletal muscle is wrapped up in deep fascia, which then becomes the tendon, along with the other three layers: epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. All three of those layers merge along with the deep fascia and become the tendon. And then the tendon attaches the muscle to the bone. So why did I go through all of that? Because I need you to build a concept of the law of Ludacris. In other words, if I pull this muscle fiber, and then I start pulling all of these muscle fibers, and then I pull all of these fascicles, and then I pull this skeletal muscle, then it's going to pull this tendon, who is attached to a bone, and then it's going to move the bone. And when the bone moves, you move just like that. Some of you probably got that right before I said it, and then some of y'all are kind of like, okay, I don't know what he's talking about. I tell you what, just go to YouTube, look up Ludacris, just type in "when I move, you move," just like that. All right, and you'll hear the song, and it'll make sense. Okay, so that's the law of Ludacris. Let's talk about it one more time. So the muscle fiber, if I can make the muscle fiber move, then I can ultimately, if I make the muscle fiber move, then ultimately I'm making the fascicle move. And when I make the bundles of fascicle move, I make the skeletal muscle move. And when I make the skeletal muscle move, I make the tendon move. And then that makes the bone move. And when the bones move, you move just like that. So we're going to have to keep in mind that most of what we're going to talk about in this chapter is actually happening on the level of a muscle fiber. Most of what we're talking about is happening just around or inside the muscle fiber itself. Whereas all the other stuff that's happening around it is almost irrelevant until you get, down to some other specifics. But muscle physiology deals a whole lot with the muscle fiber itself. Just what's going on inside of it and what's going on around it. So let's start from the beginning. We're going to back out of this. We're going to find a good starting place. And I think the best starting place is going to be, of course, with the neuromuscular junction. So let's talk about the neuromuscular junction just for a minute. We're going to look at a good photo of a neuromuscular junction right here. This is slide 61. And in this image, you can see some really weird stuff. One of the things here is a motor neuron here at the top. Now, a motor neuron probably doesn't look anything like what you would expect of a nerve cell. A motor neuron can actually speak to multiple muscle cells at the exact same time. Basically, what happens is an electrical signal passes through the axon of this motor neuron, and then it goes out through these branches of telodendria, and then these signals ultimately communicate with the muscle fibers that the motor neuron is innervating. So we can see an action potential will come down this axon, then go out through the telodendria, and then it gets to the end of that telodendria known as a synaptic knob. Now you're going to notice a lot of things in this area named that are named synaptic because of this little space right here. This whole little area right here is pretty much known as a synapse. The space of the synapse is known as a synaptic cleft. And the end of the neuron who joins this whole happy little party is known as a synaptic knob. So we've zoomed in on the muscle cell, and we can see where there's a relationship here. Now I want you to notice something real key. Here's the nerve signal. That's the electric current that's passing through the motor neuron. And it gets to the synaptic knob. There's a problem. There's a synaptic cleft here. There's an actual space. That electrical current is not going to pass that space. So we have an issue because we really want this neuron to be able to talk to this giant muscle cell. The only problem is when he goes to talk to the muscle cell, Nothing's going to happen unless we can get some communication across the synaptic cleft. So what do? This is the next slide, and this is also the next figure. This is actually 10-7B, which if you've got the textbook, you'll find is like right below the other one. This is the synaptic knob. It's just a close-up of it. We're looking at the very corner. Here's that synaptic cleft. It's still one big space. And then here is the cell membrane of the muscle cell. We still have the same problem. There's a space here. And if electrical current comes down the surface of this motor neuron, that electrical current is not going to be able to cross this space and innervate the sarcolemma, which is the cell membrane of the muscle cell or muscle fiber. So what winds up happening is when that electrical current gets down here to the surface of the synaptic knob, it causes a calcium pump, this door, to allow calcium to come in. It's a really weird thing. You'll see it come down, and I'm pointing to the wrong thing. I'm sorry. There's the calcium pump. Here's the voltage gated calcium channels. I apologize. Ignore him for right now. The action potential or electrical current comes down the surface of this motor neuron, and it stimulates these voltage gated calcium channels, and the voltage gated calcium channels open. Now you can kind of tell from the name voltage gated that it has something to do with voltage, electrical current. Henceforth, why an action potential, an electrical current, is been sent down the motor neuron down to the synaptic knob. Because of an electrical current, it stimulates, because of the voltage, it stimulates the voltage gated channels to open, which allows calcium to come in from the outside. This calcium is just calcium floating around around the interstitial fluid inside the tissues. So this is calcium anywhere inside your body. So the calcium floats in. Oh, by the way, now you see why we spent so much time teaching you about calcitriol and parathyroid hormone and calcium concentrations in the blood, because if your calcium is low, you already see where this is going. If your calcium levels are low, you're not even going to be able to pump in enough calcium to get this party started so you can have a muscle contraction. So calcium, it gets shunted in through these voltage gated channels, and then the calcium winds up binding to these vesicles. They call them synaptic vesicles, as if you couldn't already guess. We're in the synaptic knob, hovering above the synaptic cleft, and some synaptic vesicles, which are membrane bound bubbles, come into contact with calcium, and then what winds up happening is they kind of have an adhesion moment where they merge with the cell membrane of the synaptic knob, and that's what's happening here. They don't have time and space here to show you exactly what's going on, but this vesicle has actually merged with the cell membrane of the synaptic knob, and then it releases a chemical inside to actually bind to the surface of the muscle cell. These chemicals that are released are called acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine is actually what's known as a neurotransmitter. Now, if you've ever read anything about Michael J. Fox or Muhammad Ali, or you have a family member who has Parkinson's, then you know about neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are special chemicals that your central nervous system uses to have cell-to-cell conversation. This is no different. The motor neuron, who is a nerve cell, is using a neurotransmitter to speak with your muscle cell, because that electrical current that came down the surface of your synaptic knob is not going anywhere. It's going to get to the synaptic knob, and then that's going to be it. It'll be over. So that electrical current never crosses the synaptic cleft. I repeat, the electric current from the synaptic knob never crosses the synaptic cleft. Okay? Because it doesn't cross the synaptic cleft, that's why we have to release acetylcholine, the ACH, those little red dots, the neurotransmitters, because now they are going to act as our communications. if you go back in the day when you were in high school and elementary and stuff like that, if you wanted to talk to somebody across the room, you did not just blurt out that person's name and just say, "Hey, what's up, man? Hey, where you sitting for lunch today?" You did not do that, because then the teacher was going to have some words with you, and depending on who you had, it might not be a good day for the rest of the day, and it wasn't probably looking like a good week either. So if you wanted to talk to your friend across the room, you know what you had to do, right? Right. You had to write a note so that you could pass the note over to your friend. Now nowadays you just text message somebody, but you know there are some schools now that have little blockers that block your cell phone signal. So some people aren't going to be texting, and for some schools, cell phones are prohibited in school and in classrooms. So you get your cell phone snatched pretty quick. So the only other way to really get a message to somebody across the classroom is to write a note on a piece of paper, fold the piece of paper up, and get the piece of paper across the classroom to your friend, which could, happen in an assortment of interesting covert ops, funny moments, where sometimes for some people that was just simply taking the piece of paper, folding it up like a big triangle, and punting it across the classroom to the next person. That is what your motor neuron is doing to your muscle cell in this picture. That's exactly what's going on. We have just zoomed in so close that it really doesn't look like the same structures. But oh, it is. It is that motor neuron and his synaptic knob barely coming into contact with the surface of the muscle cell at the cell membrane of the muscle cell known as a sarcolemma. And so the acetylcholine is released from the synaptic vesicles, and that acetylcholine then floats across the synaptic cleft, and you can see the little red dots. They float across the synaptic cleft, and then they bind to some acetylcholine receptors that are on the surface of the muscle cell. Now, if you notice that there are these big acetylcholine receptors all along this patch of the muscle cell, but then you look at the muscle cell's surface over here, and the sarcolemma over here has nothing on it. In this area, the sarcolemma has these acetylcholine receptors, and it has invaginations to it, these little dips. However, in this area, you look at the sarcolemma has nothing on it. No acetylcholine receptors, no invaginations. You know why? Because this little section of sarcolemma is special. It has a special name known as the motor end plate. Right, the motor end plate. It's called the motor end plate because the motor neuron releases its chemicals here at the very end of the electrical travels, or the electrical roadway. This is the very end of that action potential's travels. And so we call this the motor end plate because it's a plate on the surface of this muscle cell where the signal from the motor neuron ends and acetylcholine release begins. And the acetylcholine binds to these receptors, and once it binds to the receptors, it's going to make a magical thing occur where we're going to begin to see sodium ions flood into the muscle cell, which when these sodium ions flood into the muscle cell, that's when the muscle cell will produce its own electric current, which will travel up across the sarcolemma and then go into the depths of the muscle cell to ultimately lead to the muscle cell contracting. And that's where I'm going to stop this video right now. I know it could go further, but I just want to get that point in first. I need you to just grasp that because I want to do these in pieces so that next video, we're not talking about the neuromuscular junction. In the next video, I want to get into, okay, what happened at the neuromuscular junction? You said something about it creates an action potential like an electrical current. Yes. And we're going to follow that electrical current across the sarcolemma and then inside of the cell. And then we're going to see what happens next, because what's going to happen next is going to be very, very interesting. I can assure you of that. So be Be looking for the next video on that. Be looking for me to have another talk where we're going to get into where that action potential goes after it crosses the sarcolemma and then goes inside of the muscle cell. Now, this is what I did to understand all of this material. All right. What I kind of did was I took all of the key words in the steps and kind of wrote them out. In other words, you'll notice that there's a bunch of words that just keep popping up. Sarcolemma, sarcoplasm, sarcoplasmic reticulum, motor end plate, motor neuron, synaptic vesicle, synaptic cleft, synaptic knob, acetylcholine, acetylcholine esterase, acetylcholine receptors, actin, myosin, sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium, T tubules, tropomyosin, troponin. Um, and if you didn't get all of that, just make sure you go back and rewind what I said and write all of those things down. Trust me, just rewind back and write all of those words down, because we can put all of those words in order. And if you watch these next 2 or 3 videos that we're going to do, it'll take all of those words, it'll put it all in order, and we're going to kind of walk through some things. I'm going to show you some videos in the next coming videos. Literally, I've got some animations that we're going to run. We're going to look at some different animations, and I'm going to kind of talk you through what you see with the animations, and you'll be surprised at what you're going to learn. So stay tuned. Look forward to seeing you guys soon.